2/10. That's the number. Not a rumor, not a theory floated by a broadcaster during a quiet stretch of practice. A number that came directly from Toto Wolff, days after the summer break began, confirming something George Russell had been all but shouting about for months. This landed less than 48 hours ago in an interview with a Dutch outlet, and it changes how you have to read almost everything that happened to Russell's championship campaign in the first half of this season. Let's put the pieces in order because the order is the whole story here. Back before the Hungarian Grand Prix, a pundit named Karun Chandhok floated a theory that got quietly dismissed at the time. He suggested there was something buried in the code of Russell's engine, something different from what Kimi Antonelli's side of the garage was running. At the time, that read like speculation. A broadcaster looking for an angle. Mercedes hadn't confirmed anything, and Russell himself had spent weeks being told, by his own team, that his underperformance was down to his driving style, not the machinery underneath him. Then Hungary happens. Russell's start goes wrong in a way that looks, on first glance, exactly like driver error, the kind of mistake his own teammate had already pointed to as the cause. And then, days later, in a Wire interview, Wolff says the sentence that turns the entire timeline upside down. "We had an engine problem," he says, "and it took an incredibly long time to figure out. That cost us 2/10. Subscribe right now if you want the version of this story that doesn't get buried under 6 other headlines the same week, and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from, because how much this stings probably depends on how long you've been defending George Russell in the comment sections of other channels. 2/10 a lap doesn't sound dramatic until you actually run it through a season. This isn't one bad qualifying lap. This is a deficit that Wolff himself describes as sitting there for an incredibly long time before anyone at Mercedes worked out what it actually was. Multiply 2/10 across every qualifying session and every stint of green flag racing in the first 11 rounds of this championship. And you're not talking about a rounding error anymore. You're talking about grid positions lost before the race even started, and track position lost in exactly the circuit conditions where track position at Mercedes' home turf usually decides the result. Here's the part that should genuinely bother you if you've been paying attention to what Russell has actually been saying in public. After his first lap retirement at the Belgian Grand Prix, a furious Russell told reporters, quite simply, "I just want my car to be the same as Antonelli's." That is not a driver complaining about setup preference or personal feel. That's a driver telling you, in plain language, that he suspects the 2 cars in his own garage are not equal. And for weeks, the answer coming back from inside the team was some version of, "It's your driving, mate. You're just not nailing it quite the same way." Now compare that to what Wolff just confirmed. It wasn't Russell's driving. It was an engine issue that the team itself needed an incredibly long time to even locate. Was Russell wrong to ask for equal machinery? No, Wolff has now confirmed he was right to ask. Did the team actually give him a straight answer when he first raised it? Not according to the timeline. Was the fix, whenever it eventually landed, in place in time to change anything about his championship position this season? That's the piece nobody has said out loud yet, and it's the one worth sitting with. Keep that gap in mind, because it comes back at the very end. Here's the honest counter to all of this, and it deserves real airtime before anyone hands down a verdict. Diagnosing a software issue buried inside a modern hybrid power unit is not the same as spotting a cracked wing mirror. These systems are extraordinarily complex, and an intermittent 2/10 deficit that only shows up under specific conditions can genuinely take teams a very long time to isolate, even when everyone involved is acting in good faith. Wolff didn't have to say any of this publicly. He could have let it stay buried in an internal debrief and let the season simply move on. The fact that he chose to name the number 2/10 on the record is not nothing. That's a defensible version of events. It's also not the version that explains why the public narrative inside the team, for weeks, pointed at Russell's driving rather than at an open internal question about the hardware. Do the actual math on what 2/10 means for a championship that currently sits at 59 points behind Antonelli. A tenth of a second a lap, held consistently across a full Grand Prix distance, routinely separates entire grid rows in qualifying. Across 11 rounds, that is not one lost position. That is the difference between fighting Antonelli on level terms in the first half of the season and starting every single weekend, already a step behind before a single lap is driven. Wolff is not telling you Russell would have won the championship without this. He is telling you the deficit was real, it was significant, and it was sitting there the entire time everyone assumed the problem was the man in the seat. If you're not subscribed yet, This is exactly the kind of story where the follow-up decides everything. Because the question of when this actually got fixed and whether it stays fixed heading into the second half is still completely open. Here's what makes this land harder than a normal engine confession. This isn't the first time this season Russell's side of the garage has produced a strange, hard-to-explain technical failure. In Hungary, his own start went wrong in a way that initially looked exactly like a driving mistake. His revs climbing when they should have held steady, his throttle input dropping in response, the whole sequence ending in something close to an anti-stall. Mercedes owned that one too, eventually, saying it was their fault, not his. Antonelli, 19 years old and refreshingly unfiltered, told the cool-down room afterward that he assumed it was George overcharging the battery pack on the outlap, the exact kind of mistake Bono apparently warns him against making himself. That assumption turned out to be wrong. It was a glitch. Not once, but twice this season, the explanation that reached the public first pointed at Russell, and the real explanation, when it eventually surfaced, pointed at the car. Is that a pattern? Or is it two unrelated technical issues that happen to land on the same side of the garage by coincidence? I'm not going to pretend I know the answer with certainty. What I can tell you is that Wolff himself has now, on the record twice this season, walked back an explanation that initially put the blame on Russell's driving. That's not proven to be deliberate. It is a fair question for anyone watching to ask. Every opportunity for this deficit to have been caught earlier existed the moment Russell first raised it publicly. The team had the driver's own testimony, the comparison data against Antonelli's identical machinery, and months of racing to isolate the variable. Instead, according to Wolff's own account, it took an incredibly long time. Whether that delay reflects the genuine difficulty of the diagnosis or a team slower than it should have been to take its own driver's complaint seriously is exactly the argument this confession opens up. Zandvoort is next, and it's the first real test of whether whatever fix Mercedes applied actually holds. If Russell's pace closes back toward Antonelli's in equal conditions, that confirms the 2/10 story completely. If the gap persists even after Wolff's public confession, then 2/10 was never the whole explanation, and Mercedes has a much harder question waiting for them heading into Monza. Here's the verdict. Toto Wolff telling the truth about a real quantified performance deficit is the right instinct, and it deserves credit rather than cynicism by default. But an admission that arrives after the points are already lost is not the same as an admission that arrives in time to change anything. Russell asked for equal machinery months ago. He is only now getting the number that proves he was right to ask. What still isn't answered, and what a video honest about this story has to say plainly, is whether the fix landed in time to matter for this season, or whether 2/10 a lap simply became the permanent cost of a problem that took too long to find. So tell me, does this change your read on Russell's season? Or did you already assume something like this was going on? Like for changed, comment for assumed. And if you've been telling people all year that Russell's struggles weren't just about his driving, say so below, because a lot of you called this exact shape of story back when we covered his engine complaints after Spa. Subscribe, because when Zandvoort tells us whether this fix actually holds, I'm covering it the moment the data comes in. Until the next one.